Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. If you can hear me just fine, just type in the chat box and confirm that you're hearing me all right. Just like to do a sound check at the start. Hi, Todd. Welcome back. So how did everyone find this week's work? I know several of you have expressed that the color stage is more challenging than you expected and took a little more time. I mentioned this earlier, but doing these color studies are it's really gonna pay off when you go into your larger painting. So you're gonna be very happy we did this extra step. Hi, Marianne. Welcome. That's okay. If you were in a workshop, you probably had plenty of work cut out for you. So if you do your color study, just post it in the forum if you want some feedback. Hi, Penny. Glad you guys could make it. All right, so we have another minute before we get started officially. Thank you, Todd. I'm glad you liked the lesson. So does anyone have any questions? Let's just talk about a few things that maybe you guys struggled with, or any questions you might have had just in general about the last week's content. Or if you have questions about any of the colors that we used or brands. I know I tried to get back to everyone pretty quickly who had questions in the forum about substitutions for certain colors. So I know that a couple of you had issues with like your cadmium red, for example, being a little different than mine. So just to explain a little further, I'm using cadmium red light, which is a little bit more of an orange cadmium. It's a little more yellow. And if you have like a cadmium red deep, it's going to be a little bit more of a blue red. Or if you have a cadmium medium, and this can also vary largely between brands. The same thing with burnt sienna and yellow ochre. There can be quite a distinction between brands. So your colors might have turned out a little differently than mine, but that's okay. That's just kind of part of developing your palette. And like I like yellow ochre in a certain brand, and I tend to stick with it. I really like the RGH yellow ochre. It's a nice vibrant yellow ochre, whereas if you go with a few other brands, you might get one that's a little more muddy. But I find that I like the more vibrant ochre because I can always dull my colors by adding neutrals to it, or adding like a complementary color. So I like to start with maybe a more buttery yellow ochre. But it's about kind of finding your palette and sticking with those colors or those brands. Penny, let me read over your question. So you wondered about the color of the shirt being used elsewhere in the painting to unify it at all. It's not really necessary, but if you feel like the color is jumping out too much, you can either neutralize or darken the background, or you can bring that green in the shirt a little bit lower in chroma. And then you can also consider looking in the face where the green does influence some of the colors in the lower jaw. It does reflect a little bit and influence the skin tones in those areas. And then other planes, we'll talk about this when we go over each of your color studies, but some of the other planes that are facing, the backdrop, those are picking up more of the violets. So that's kind of how you unify it. Or if you were wanting to do like a landscape behind your subject, or put them in a different environment, you just have to recognize that those colors will start to influence whatever planes are facing towards that wall or that background. So the other question from Mary Ann is there any data on burnt sienna cracking with age or fading with time? I haven't had any issues with it. It has a light fastness rating of 1. if you get true burnt sienna, a good quality brand, then you shouldn't have any issue. A lot of cracking, there are some pigments that are known to crack. For example, zinc. Any mixture that contains zinc pigment is notorious for cracking. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to crack, but it's just more likely to. But a lot of cracking with other colors has more to do with your technique. Fat not following the fat over lean, or applying really, really heavy impastos on a flexible surface such as stretched canvas. That's going to increase the chances of your work cracking. I typically only work with pigments that are a light fastness rating of 1, which is the best. So you want to stick to that. That's one of the reasons why I don't use actual alizarin crimson. I use anthraquinone red or quinacridone red as a substitute, because it's a very close color to alizarin crimson and it's more light fast. So no, I haven't heard of anything about burnt sienna, but a lot of that could be due to the, because it's just like a synthetic iron oxide. So it shouldn't crack any more than like a transparent red oxide. So you just make sure that you're getting a quality brand. Okay, so, and it's not a required color. You could use, I talked about this in the earlier critique group. There are several like iron oxide types of colors that you could use instead of burnt sienna. But one thing that you'll notice when you mix them with white, do a tinting test where you mix a string of white into that color, you'll notice a difference in how the color tints. So burnt sienna tends to stay more neutral, kind of a more grayish red. Transparent red oxide is going to go more yellow. As soon as you introduce white, it tends to fade more towards yellow. And then, like for example, an English red or even a Indian red. Indian red goes more violet, blue-violet, when you add white to it. And then you have like English red, which goes more towards like a very soft pink. And those are all different colors you could try exploring and seeing if you like the behavior. But burnt sienna is kind of that neutral color, and I like to use it when I'm teaching and I tend to use it in my work, but it kind of is a good starting point for a neutral red. I also teach just using the Zorn palette, which is cad red, yellow ochre, white, and blue or black. But the issue with that is you're constantly fighting cadmium red, because cadmium red is a very potent bright red. So there's a lot of work you have to do to even get something that looks like burnt sienna. So just as a nice quick shortcut, you can just grab burnt sienna. Transparent red oxide could work similarly, but you could mix a little blue into it and get something maybe a little bit more like burnt sienna, but it's going to be much more transparent just by nature. Oh, you're very welcome. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump into the critiques. Todd, we're going to start with you. So before, I noticed this was a little bit of an issue with some of the other students in the morning. The photographs were coming out warmer or lighter than what your study looks like in person. So when we first start off, I'm going to ask you, if you're in here live, to let me know if you need me to darken the photo reference of your painting, or if you need me to like change the temperature. So like in this case, Todd, is this looking a little bit more yellow than what your color study looks like in real life? Just type in the chat box and let me know. And is it also lighter, or does it need to go a little darker? So just let me know and I'll make some adjustments here. And the reason I'm doing that is just to make sure I'm not unnecessarily telling you to change something if it's just that the photograph is coming across that way. I realize that this is a challenge to capture your work accurately, and that's why I had some of those suggestions. And I was talking a little bit earlier about the best method for photographing without glare. Now, you don't have a glare issue here, but one of the things that I explained this morning was that when you're, I'll just do a little diagram sketch here real quick while I'm waiting for your response. When you're photographing your painting, you want your camera's lens to be at the center of the canvas, right? I'm drawing it kind of on an angle, but obviously you would have it directly in front, like that. You want it at that middle height. You want to make sure it is square to the surface of the painting. So you don't want it like tilted like this or like this, because that's going to result in distortion. And then when you're lighting, you want to make sure, I'm going to just redraw this down here. So let's say you have your canvas here, you have your lens camera here, kind of pointed at the center. It's better if it's on a tripod. If you're shooting with a physical camera, it's okay if you're using your phone. Just try to make sure it's square to the surface and a little bit far away. You don't want to bring it up so close that it's going to cause the image to warp. But another thing that's important is having your lights sit at kind of a 45-degree angle from the upper corners of your painting. So you want to have your light source kind of on a little bit in front of the canvas at a 45-degree angle from those upper corners, approximately. But what that will do is give you a very even light, and it will also prevent really strong glare. Okay, now if your canvas is tilted slightly back and you have those lights up there, you're going to get glare at the top. So you want to make sure it's upright this way, propped up on an easel. Those are just some pointers. This is especially going to be important when we start moving into our larger paintings. You guys are going to want to send me really, really good shots. You will also, I would encourage you to photograph under the same light source that you're painting under. However, if you're painting under a warmer light source, it's going to throw off your color. And it's going to throw off the photograph color. So I would recommend going down to the hardware store and buying a CFL. That's just the compact fluorescent, you know, the little screw bulbs. And the ones that are like a little coil. And just make sure you're buying the one that is cool light. It will usually say like a Kelvin or a K rating. And you want something around 5,000 Kelvin, as close to that as you can get. Because natural light is around 6,000 Kelvin, I believe. So that's just going to give you it's going to be kind of bluish light. It's not something that's the most pleasant to have in your room at your house, but it is a very natural kind of light for accurate color rendering. Okay, and you can actually buy bulbs that have an accurate color rendering index, or CRI, of like 90 or higher, I think is what you want. I'll see if I can find a little information source and post it in the forum for everyone who's wanting to kind of set up their studio space with the proper lighting. But those are just things to keep in mind. What kind of lights are you using, Todd? Okay, I'm going to work on cooling off your picture here. But what kind of light bulbs are you working with? Okay. See, I'm going to just do a little color balancing here. So I'm just going to take away some of the yellow. So you're saying it's a little more blue-gray purple. So I'm going to take away some of that. So I'm just playing with this. I'm just trying to pull away from some of that yellow. Okay. Let me try and move. So let's do a little bit of adjustment to the values too, because I feel like it's photographed maybe a little bit dark, or I mean a little light. Maybe a touch saturated. So does that look a little bit closer to your colors? So you're working with yellowish wall lights and then one light aimed up at the roof. Okay, so actually what you're doing, reflecting light off the roof is a great, off your ceiling, is a great way to kind of evenly light your painting. So if you can't do that 45-degree angle on your, like a direct light, then doing exactly that, reflecting light off the ceiling, you'll need it brighter, but it will evenly light your painting and make it really nice to work under. So if you get some of those cool light bulbs to balance out those warm ones, then you'll be just fine. You'll notice a big difference. Yeah, the glare can be annoying when you're working. So if you bounce the light off of the ceiling, just get the cooler bulbs. If you're working with fluorescence, or even if you're working with LED lights, they all have a temperature gauge. Usually it'll say, you know, a Kelvin rating on the package. So just get it close to that 6,000 Kelvin, at least for some bulbs. And then you can have some warm ones mixed in there, and it will kind of give you this nice even lighting. But I typically stick close to that. I use actually like an LED video light panel, and it tends to give me, well, it has a remote control, so I can control actually the temperature. I can go from being very warm to very cool. It gives me the Kelvin rating, and also I can adjust the brightness or the dimness, so I can avoid that overpowering light. So just give that a try, and you might notice a bit of a difference as you mix your colors. So you might find yourself adjusting some of your mixtures. Yes, I'll post the link to the light that I use. I actually have it mounted on the ceiling. I just bought like a, what is it called? It's a video wall mount. It's for like mounting video cameras to like the ceiling. But because my panel light actually has a tripod mount, I was able to just put it up and mount it above my easel with just a few screws, which is really convenient. It also runs off battery or plug-in. The batteries don't tend to last very long, so I have mine plugged in constantly. But I'll post a link to that Amazon where you can buy it. And I think it's around $50 now. It was more expensive when I bought it, but it's an older model, so only by like a year. And it's real lightweight, so it's real portable and nice. So I'll share that on our forum a little bit later this afternoon. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about your portrait. I think you had mentioned something like you felt like it was a little bit warm, and I would agree with you on that. I think probably what you're going to want to do is bring this background a little bit more neutral. What's happening, I think, is because you've applied the purple kind of transparently. It's bringing out some more of the red, because I can see where you applied it a little bit thicker. For example, right in here, it's taking on more of that blue cast that we see here in the background. I'm going to bring this up a little bit bigger. Okay, so so my suggestion would be to do another pass of that purple. It's a kind of a neutral purple brown. There's some areas that are more blue. You know, the background, it's a professional photography backdrop that has multiple colors in there. So, you know, you don't have to get every single color, but just get a general sense. And so if you just gave it another coat, and what I would do is focus on pushing the value down, because that's going to add more vibrancy to the portrait. So just give another coating. You can have a gradient, you can have it darker or lighter on different sides if you want. But just give it a little more solidity and take away some of that red. And of course that makes her skin tones more vibrant. And what I'm seeing here is that we need to, while you don't have to go as cool as she is in this picture, I think there's some areas where you're going to want to take out, for comparison, a little bit of the red undertone. So in here, you might consider going in with more of a cool gray, maybe a little darker, something like that. That's part of her shirt, kind of influencing in here. Same thing with the neck. If you just take, even if you just took the color that you have used here and you go in and mix a little bit of the blue-gray into that skin tone, you'll kind of find a happy middle that will kind of just cool off her skin tone overall and incorporate some of that purple into the background. I think you have some nice reds in the cheek area, and I like some of the neutrals you have in the forehead, even though she is cooler. So let's do some quick comparisons. There's the color you have for that area, and here is the color that she has in that area. You're pretty close to the right value. You're just a lot more yellow. So all you would have to do really is take this color here, and add a little bit of blue and white, and I think you'll end up here. If it kind of goes too green because of the yellow, you might have to add a little bit of like alizarin. But you should end up somewhere a little bit like that. And it doesn't mean you have to cover all of the warm, but you can see that if we introduce just a little bit of that in that cool transition, her forehead has a lot of cool tone in there. It's going to start to balance out that heavy warmth that we see. I'm thinking mostly like right in there, just before it turns to the shadow. Then have those warmer colors and then those cooler highlights. Another thing is, I think just in general, your value range, usually everyone has the opposite problem. They wash out their tones too quickly. Everything goes kind of white and bright too fast, and you've really preserved your highlights. But I do think you can actually push them a little bit brighter. Let me get, yeah, you can see that temperature shift is quite a bit cooler. But if you just find, like, for example, this light tone and you just bring it out a little bit more, especially as it comes into this plane here and this plane here, and a little bit in the chin, even though it's much smaller as far as the amount of light that there is. The forehead doesn't have it all the way across. I think you're pretty good on where you place that. And then I would just brighten up. And maybe the nose got a little too red. I would just pull that back a little bit. Let's see. Let's find. It's pretty cool. But I think if we took like the color that you have there, and we just brought it maybe a little lighter and more neutral. So maybe adding some white to that color. Maybe a little darker. It should cool it off just enough. Let me make a little more red. Yeah, something like that. So to where it's still more pink than, let's say, other parts of the face, but it's not nearly as red. Now, right before you have this form turn under to the shadow, you will get a little bit of a pickup of red, and that can be useful to have a tile there where you have like a red kind of tile before that shadow on the underside of the nose, that can be really helpful in bringing the nose forward. So you can see how I left that tile there, and now it feels like a more colorful portion of the face, but it's not looking too red. Down here might be a little dark, so I would just make sure you're following your color scheme. Maybe something in between, a light scumble. And we'll end up doing a lot of this too, you'll notice in the larger piece. But something like that. So if we take this away, you can see how it's just made the left side of her face a little more brilliant. And she has a very cool, almost that same color we have up here in the forehead. So this color is what's lighting, it's that lightest part here in this cheek. So I think if you kind of cooled that off a little bit, maybe made it somewhere in between those two colors, so there is some peach tone to it. But that would start to incorporate, and you can see now that we're zoomed out, that purple is reflecting into some of those skin tones, as is the green of her shirt. And it's just balancing out, and it makes it a little more exciting because not everything's just all warm. You have that beautiful combination of warm and cool playing together. And it's really emphasizing those color zones of the face. So we have that, let me get a marker here. So we have the red zone, the blue-gray zone, and then the kind of neutral or yellow zone. So you definitely have more of the red in here, and you definitely have these dominant kind of gray tones. With the only exception down here is usually the chin. There's a little bit of a pickup of a pink in there, and you have that, so I left that there, but it will turn cool just before it hits that shadow. But you can see there's this pickup of kind of a pinky color there. And oftentimes I do exaggerate my color just a little bit to make a painting more exciting. So you're kind of pulling from the reference, but you're also, you're creating a painting. So you can take some artistic license with your color, so long as you're using sound color theory and you're paying attention to the overall temperature shifts. That's what matters, and that's what kind of defines our palette as artists. As you become more familiar with color mixing, that's how you can often identify one artist's work from another, is their color palette and the way they use it. But this is just about getting kind of familiar with that. The only other thing I would say is you could probably neutralize some of the red in the hair just a touch. I actually really like that undertone. You see it the most near her highlight, but I think actually what you need is just a little more contrast in the hair, to get her to pop forward from that background. So like here, we get this soft gradient kind of coming down her hair. So I would look at how you can utilize that nice silhouette there to really get her to pop forward as well. Okay, so Tammy, I'll go over that one more time. So the color zones of the face, I'll do it on the photograph here. If you look at some of the artists that really emphasize this were like the Dutch painters. And if you look at a Rembrandt painting or a Van Dyck painting, you'll definitely start to see this. They really emphasize the red zone. So this is the red zone. And that's because we get the red in the nose and the cheeks. Okay, so the capillaries come to the surface. You also get it a little bit in the lower lid. Then it starts to transition right around the mouth. You'll usually start to see it right around the jawline, just below the cheekbone. You'll notice there's a kind of a green zone. So we have red zone. We'll call this the blue-green zone. It's the cool section. And the reason we get this is because you'll notice that on our face we have a little more peach fuzz in that lower section of the face. We also don't have the rosy capillaries coming to the surface of the skin. And that creates this cooling effect. And it is more obvious on men because they have stubble or facial hair. but it exists on women too. It's just a little bit less strong. You know, it's a little more subtle. And then this upper zone of the face is also known as the yellow zone. They overemphasized it a lot in that Dutch painting, but it's also often kind of a neutral zone. You'll see areas of pink and you'll see areas of blue or gray. And so I always just consider it maybe a little more of a neutral zone. Did that help clarify? Okay, so just keep those things in mind as you work. They're good things to pay attention to. You'll also notice anywhere where we tend to have a little bit of peach fuzz, not that you want to give her a mustache, but this area is typically a little bit cooler, especially as it pulls up from the corners of the mouth. You'll see this little tiny halftone. And if you make that cooler, just slightly, than the surrounding flesh tones like what you have here, then you're going to notice it's going to feel very natural. You know, it's going to, and it's also going to help emphasize the color of the lip. So I'll show you, for example, what that color looks like. So there we have something like that. And on this side, it's like this. And then we go above that and we have this pink flesh tone. You also see a little bit of that cool tone underneath the lip. So just, like I said, they're subtly cooler. I tend to emphasize it a little bit more. And you can see over here, we have a very strong gray. That's, you know, it's obviously not that concentrated or dark, but that's somewhere in here. And that's what I mean by that gray-green zone. And that can vary a lot depending on the person's natural skin tone. If they have a more yellow or olive or warm skin tone, those areas all appear more green. Whereas on our model, she's a little bit more pale. She has a little bit of a cooler complexion, and so we see these as more of like a gray violet. They kind of fall in that range a little bit more. Okay, so Todd, do you have any questions? So those are my main suggestions. You can go lighter on the neck here. Let me get back to my oil brush. But just remember not to let it compete too much with the highlights in the face. And you know, the neck area is a great area to kind of look when you're trying to determine if the model has warm or cool skin tone, because sometimes in the face there's so much going on that it's hard to identify. But if you look at an area where the skin is very thin and transparent, and maybe they're not as affected by the sun, you can tell by the dominant kind of color in that area. So you can see that here she has a very cool undertone to her skin. Even though the face is always a little bit more like red or toned because of the sun, you can tell that generally she has that cool undertone. So your question, Todd, on the cheek on the left, her right, you see it going gray, then pinkish, then up to a cool type highlight. Yes, yes. So it's cool as this rounds down, and then it goes to a little bit more of a neutral pink. I have it here a little bit maybe more pink than it is. Let me grab this. And that's just because you have such a warm tone here. But you could go maybe a little bit cooler. Just as soon as you get up into these cheeks here where it's more red and rosy, you're going to want to find a kind of a pink that will help you transition into that. And maybe make that red on this side not so hot of a color. It's okay to push it a little bit on this side, but this is probably too hot of a color. You would see that more in the lips perhaps. What I would suggest is going maybe a little bit, introduce a little bit of your background color, this purple, into that red. So if you took that red color here and you mixed it with a little bit of the background color, you would end up with something in between, and I'm thinking it would look, make it a little more red. You would end up with something maybe like that. Now let's push it a little more red than that. Yeah, what really gives the chroma in that area is actually the transition out of the cheek being a little bit more of a vibrant pink. So when it gets closer to that shadow, make sure you're going maybe a little bit deeper. And don't be afraid to push a little bit darker with this side shadow or the core shadow because it's going to give you a little more volume and take down some of the red in that reflected light. Just a little glaze will do it, but that's going to really balance out the portrait. Any other questions? Thank you, Marianne. I'm glad you find it helpful. I mean, if we were all working in the same, like in a physical workshop, I'd be coming over and mixing on your palette. So this is the next best thing as far as being able to show you some of the differences there. So it's just about bringing a little bit of balance to the color and making, when we do these color studies, it's kind of your first attempt at analyzing the colors, and we don't always hit it on the mark. And even my color study for the class, I'm going to be making changes from that color study when I work on the larger piece because I see a few more warm tones that I needed to add in there. So it's about kind of finding that balance. So Todd, you have a question. I wonder how to intermingle the cool highlights with some of the warmish type highlights at the same time without it looking odd. I know exactly what you're talking about. The way I do that is, and I'll talk about this a little bit when we get into actually blocking in on our large painting. But I like to juxtapose 3 different kinds of highlights, colors next to each other. Kind of think of the way like an abalone shell feels like it really is bright. And a lot of that is because there is a yellow, a pink, and a blue right next to each other. And so it's actually an optical effect, and a trick of the eye. And it's just something I've found that works best for me. But what I'll do is let me just grab, I'm just going to grab from this palette here. So let's say I take a blue, but I'm going to bring it at a really bright value. So it's a white, but it has a slight tint of blue. Okay, so I'm just going to do this up here. And I place that right there. And then I take that same color, same value, and I go with a pink. And I take that same value and I go in with a pale yellow. When we zoom out, of course these are not blended, but when we zoom out, and I think I need to make that blue a little bit lighter. Yeah, so they should be close to near white when they're next to each other. So, and it's really important that the values are similar. But when you zoom out, the colors kind of intermingle and create this vibrancy. So oftentimes what I end up doing is bringing those colors together and they end up blending a little bit with each other. but it creates this kind of optical illusion of something kind of sparkling. It makes it a little more exciting to the eye than just one single color. So when you get into the specular highlights, there's going to be some that feel cooler and some that feel warmer, but what I often do for the most dominant ones is this combination here. And I can post some close-ups of some of my paintings where that's really obvious. And they might not be perfectly adjacent, but there might be like an area that is like a more yellow zone next to a pinker zone, next to a blue or gray zone, and it just keeps it more exciting. Did that help answer your question? The key is keeping the value the same, so that way like the perception of the colors coming together, and of course with the paint we're actually physically blending them a little bit together so they don't they're not as jarring as that example, but it can help to make the colors a little more exciting. So if I took a brush here, let's just see if I can do it on top here. It's kind of a tight space, but if I took that yellow, grabbed a blue, maybe put a blue next to it, and then transition to a pink as it moves away from the highlight. And transitions into the cheek. You see how that almost sparkles? That's how you get something to feel like it's glowing. It's a trick of the eye. It's basically it's not there in the photograph. This is just something I kind of learned through experimentation with placing different tiles next to each other to get different optical effects. But that feels brighter, that combination, than just picking, let's say, a generic flesh tone and making it a lighter color. That's not as exciting. Do you see what I mean? It's subtle, but it's going to make a difference in the painting. So try experimenting with that. That you can see the difference there. I'm glad it came across in the digital painting because I know it works in physical oil paint, but I wasn't sure if it would come across that way here. Okay, so let me get rid of that other highlight there. Do you want me to leave that little blue, pink, yellow example on there? Yeah, it's way better with more colors. It's kind of an inventive element, and you tend to see colors this way more when you paint from life. Photographs tend to lose a little bit of that unless you know what you're looking for. And if you take a really well-balanced picture, then sometimes you'll see these things a little bit more obvious. It's kind of like working with that idea of iridescent. Like when you look at iridescent pigments, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing pink shimmering against blue, green, and yellow, and it's basically taking the complementary colors but placing them next to each other, and it creates that shimmer. I'll go ahead and leave that on there. I'm not saying you have to put that in your color study, but you're more than welcome to experiment with that. It doesn't need to be quite that bright there, but just as an example for you to have. All right, let me know if you have any further questions as you continue to work on your color study. Okay, Brenda. Are you in here, Brenda? I'm going to post a little bit on how to photograph these small pieces, because I noticed on some of these with the canvas, it's really, really hard to get a even photograph. Yeah, it's easy to do that. And also when you're working this small, the canvas texture really, really shows up. So don't worry about it too much, but when you do photograph your larger piece, try to make sure that there isn't any glare towards the top, because it'll help me see the colors a little bit more accurately. So let me ask you really quick, if does the color feel pretty accurate to what you feel, what you look at when you see it in person? It doesn't look like it's too warm to me, but I just wanted to make sure it looks pretty balanced and it's the right value. Does it need to be darker? I can try bringing down some of the, oops. bringing down some of that a little bit darker, but just let me know if it looks drastically different than how it feels in person. So my first impression is that the background is just a little too red. And I think in order to get her skin tone to kind of sing and really pop out, I think it would be a good idea to go in with more of an opaque violet. So if you took the value that you, or the color that you've mixed for it, let me see if I can identify it on the palette here. Looks like it might have been this color. Is that correct? Was this the color down here for your background? It looks like you actually might even have something close, but it looks a little red. So I think if you took that color and added a little bit more blue to it, you would end up with a little more of a neutral. And that's not to say that you can't go with a darker value of that same color. So like you can make it a little bit darker. If you like that contrast, that's perfectly fine. But I think just getting it a little bit less of that berry red color and getting it a little more neutral, it's going to help the skin tone stand out a little bit more. And you can create like a gradient and have like a lighter blue-gray. Try just using a little more of an opaque, maybe mix a little bit of white into the mixture, and that will help to kind of balance out some of the colors. Also, whenever we mix a color, but then we apply it really thin, it's almost like you're treating it as a glaze, and that can bring out and enhance a certain element of that color where it doesn't actually match what you've mixed here. That actually happened in another student's piece, and they had mixed a color when I did the test of their color off the palette. It was very, very close to what they needed, but they didn't apply it thick enough, and so that warmer color started to come through because of that transparency. So sometimes that can happen if you apply it too thin. And so just keep that in mind when you move into your larger piece. You don't want to be thinning out your paint anymore. You don't want to use any medium unless your paint is so thick and pasty that you can't get it to move on your brush. Then just add 1 or 2 drops of linseed oil to your paint pile and mix it in with a palette knife. But you don't want to be diluting with your brush at this point, because you want to follow that fat over lean, and our underpainting had already had a slightly thicker layer, and that was the leaner layer, so we need to make sure every layer above that is applied a little bit thicker and more opaque and not so watery. Okay, so I think same thing goes, once you get that background a little bit more opaque, I would push some of the contrast in the hair a little bit. You have that nice red undertone, so I feel like if you just went over it with a darker brown, kind of in a where it needs to be a little bit more silhouetted against the background. You can see she has a little more of that here, even though it's like a reddish brown, and it's a little bit lighter than that side. She has these darker areas that kind of brings a level of neutral color and contrast, and that's kind of the key here, is we want that her hair to kind of contrast against the background. And you'll notice her hair is a little bit more ochre of a, she has some red in there. Like you look here, it's kind of a red brown, but then it turns into more of like a neutral ochre type color, especially down here towards the ends where it gets a little bit more kind of faint. So, and there are those red kind of transitions there. So just think in those masses. You don't have to get real detailed with the hair. It's just a matter of making it so that you kind of know what you're going for when we move into the larger piece. It looks like, based on your colors here on the mixture, I know they probably feel a little different here. They feel very cool. You're in the right color zone though. If I look at this color, that feels very similar to what I see in certain areas. It's a little peachy, but it will work nicely for those transitions out of the let me bring up another layer here. Those transitions out of the kind of pink zone. I see a little bit of that like in this area here. There's this undertone of a little bit of a warmer hue before it goes back to being like a cooler pink towards that highlight. The gray greens, this looks like a nice neutral color. I feel like it just got a little muddy and unclear where those colors are positioned. Let me paint that in again. So I definitely see that down towards the bottom. It's picking up a little more because of her shirt. It might be a little yellow. I'm thinking maybe you might want to push a little more blue or some of her shirt color into that. I'm only thinking that because down here it should start to pull in just a little bit of that color. Not real heavy, but maybe just a touch. And then, of course, if you're going to be building the contrast in the hair, you'll want to build that contrast in the shadow of the face. And I think it's only not that dark because, again, your application was on a little bit on the thin side. If it's really hard for you to paint at this scale, you could do your color studies a little bit bigger. Just don't do them to the same scale as your original painting because it'll just take too long. And the idea for painting small is to keep it from partly taking up too much time, but also to keep it from you getting into too much detail. Your color mixtures look really nice. This might be a little warm for a reflected light, but this shadow color looks pretty good. It's a little bit more opaque here. I would try maybe taking this color. Let me move that layer up so you can see. So this color, and maybe make it a little bit darker. So add a little bit of blue, and this one too, add a little bit of blue, just to remove some of that orange, because it's not nearly as strong in the picture. She has a little bit of that glow under here, but if you see the color sample, it's just like this warm, deep brown. So if you added a little bit of blue, you'd end up with that color. And then this one, I would just bring it down into more of a rust for those reflected areas. And even that's a little vibrant, but if you wanted to push that warmth, you could. It adds a nice kind of glow. The only other thing I would say is make sure when you get down into this area in the jaw that you keep it a little bit on the slightly darker side, especially as it starts to turn. However, it's not as green over here because it's starting to pick up some of that background. So you might take some of your background color and make it a little bit lighter. So just add some white to it until it's around close to the value that you need, and use a little bit of that over here as that turns under. It might pick up a little more of the green right next to that shadow edge, but as it transitions out, go a little bit cooler, and then I would emphasize some of the warmth in a few areas, like the color zone in the forehead is a little more yellow, and it gets cooler towards the highlight. And I can't quite tell if your color here, just because it's a little bleached out, if it's too yellow. It might be. You might need to make it a little bit of a cooler color. But that's introducing that, because in your color study it feels actually quite cool, but when I look at your color over on the palette, it feels a little warmer, so it's hard for me to tell which one is more true. But I think if you just balance it out a little bit like that, it'll start to read a little better. And these like warmer browns, the lighter one, actually is a great color for the smaller shadows in the face, because usually there's a little bit of light reflecting into like the shadow mask for the nose and eye socket. So just maybe warm that up a little bit. Do you have any questions? Yeah, your colors here on the palette look really beautiful, so I can't tell if it's just because they got painted a little thinner on your painting. Okay, so they're a little pinker. So they're probably pretty close to what you need, because she does have these very pinkish highlights, but if you put them on and they feel a little bit too, if they feel a little bit too yellow, just cool them off a little bit. You can do that by adding a very small amount of blue and alizarin, and just see if that helps. But I would definitely paint the head maybe a little bigger. You could even start fresh. You don't have to try and correct this color study. If you just want to start again, I would recommend, was this 5x7? If you're working 5x7, you might want to make sure the head is, I don't know, like about that big. Even if you can't fit the whole body in there, you know, just make sure it gives you a little more room to work. And if you want me to take a look at your second color study in the middle of the week, then just post it in the forum and I'll give you some feedback. I don't know if I mentioned this in our group yet. Okay, so it was 5x7. Okay. So I haven't mentioned this in our group yet, but I did mention it this morning if you guys were watching earlier. So today there are weeks 4 lessons, which are more just lectures, and I'm talking about planes and the importance of understanding planes when we move into our tiling. And I do a tiling demo, so I think there's three videos, each about 40 minutes each, 30 to 40 minutes. So they'll take a little while to watch. But I'm actually grouping week 4 and 5 together because this is kind of a big week. We're going to start working the first color pass on our large portraits, and it's a lot of work. It's going to take probably several days. For some of you, it might take the whole week. So I'm actually giving you guys week 5, which is when we start physically painting on our large pieces. I'm going to give that to you early. It's going to be here middle of the week, probably Wednesday. And that way it gives you guys a full week to work on the first color pass. And everyone might feel like they need a little bit more time. I just don't want you guys to rush. So until you get that lesson, watch the preliminary lectures, because they're going to help kind of clarify what we're thinking about when we work on in color, and also work on correcting your color studies. So I just wanted to go over that really quickly for everyone. So you won't have to turn in homework next weekend. I will probably, depending on if people have questions, I might hold a live session, but I think everyone's going to be in the middle of working, so there's not going to be anything to show. So I'm going to give you guys until the following weekend. And I'll post the dates just as a reminder, but remember it's in our critique outline, what dates we'll be having critiques. And I'll keep up with everyone on the forum this week because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Okay, Tammy. Are you in here, Tammy? I think I saw you. I wanted to show this. You actually sent this picture, but you also sent a couple of other ones of just your painting and then just your palette. But I wanted to show this because it's a great example of what you can do to save samples of your color. Oh, there you are. Hi, Tammy. So I really like what you did here, and I just wanted to share it with the class. So it looks like you did this in a sketchbook, which is perfectly fine. You can do oil sketches in a sketchbook. You just, I don't know if you gessoed your paper or not, but if you apply a coat of gesso to your sketch paper, you can do these sketches inside. Or you can buy the oil paper, which is still a little absorbent, but I think Arches makes it. But anyhow, the way you saved samples of your palette and your mixtures is really going to help. So those of you who still have your mixtures, and they haven't dried out too much, then you might consider making a little palette on a scrap piece of canvas or a piece of paper, and just give yourself some little notes on what you would put in the mixtures. Also, as you guys are going through and adjusting your colors after our critique today, make notes on those things so that you remember by the time you get to your larger painting. Another thing is if your colors are dried out or they are a little bit too small of a pile, you will want to start working on mixing these out before you get the lesson, just to save yourself some time so you can start to slowly build these piles up a little bit larger so that you have plenty of paint to work with. And also larger piles of paint don't tend to dry out as much. So, so just a couple of things to keep in mind as you guys are making corrections to your color study. I thought this was a great example. And I also like this because I could actually see your painting and the reference and your palette all under one light source. And so it gives me a little bit of a better example and a sense of, you know, how you're interpreting, because you're working from a print, so it's going to looks like it looks a little warmer than what I'm seeing in my photo reference digitally. So I'll keep that in mind here. So here we have your color study and your palette, and I can see you've marked on your palette here. You've labeled with a marker. That's also a very handy tip when you're first starting and you get all these mixtures out. It's very easy to get kind of mixed up and confused. So as a way to organize your palette, it's very helpful. You can use like dry erase marker or Sharpie. Okay, so I just want to ask you really quick, Tammy, is this photo, does it feel a little bright, light in value? Based on what I could see here, this looks considerably darker. So I just want to know so that I can bring this value down a little bit on the picture. I feel like it looked a little bit more like that. And also your photo reference. I'm going to pull that down here and use that instead of my picture. I'm only doing that because you are working from a print. Do you plan to continue working from your print, or do you plan to work from a monitor or something else? So this picture looks a little warm. So let me cool that off a little bit. Take out some of the yellow and the red. How's that? Is that a little better? Okay. Yeah, let me know if this reference doesn't look accurate, the one I have that's your printout. If that looks a little warm, I can move back to using the other photo reference. Yeah, I know it's hard. Just moving forward, Tammy, it might be better for you to just use your laptop. Um, Only just because you don't want to confuse your eye when you're attempting to mix the final kind of color palette for your larger piece. So, would it be better for me to use this reference instead, since you might be working from your laptop? I'm only trying to find the balance here because I don't want, if you're working from a warmer print, I don't want to make you change all of your colors because I'm trying to match it to the digital version. Um, I'm definitely seeing a trend of yellow in the skin tone. So when I look at like your range here, moving across this direction, I see a very yellow kind of light here. So I would take some of these colors and maybe introduce a little bit more of a pink. But then I think the transition tones here are the ones that are going to make the difference. So your color study is not that yellow. Yeah, let me see if I can fix that a little bit more. Sometimes there's only so much you can do about taking out some of the yellow. Okay, I tried to make that a little bit more neutral. So what you'll notice though is that she has these kind of cooler mauve tones that serve as that transition, and part of that is the background color influencing influencing that. So what I selected here is a color like that, which I don't quite see on your palette. And that's right here in this transition to the forehead. So I think if you went in but just before the green and you added a little bit more of a cool violet, it's going to help start to balance. I actually see some of that, almost that color there. And another place we see something very close to that, it's just a little more gray and darker, is down in the lower jaw. So just try maybe cooling off that side plane, and I would watch the lectures on the side planes of the face so you can see what I mean and how we can emphasize that. I think that same color, but maybe a little darker, might serve as a nice transition tone in here. Even though you will have a little bit more of that blue-green, your greens might be a little yellow in here. And I would try maybe pushing them a little bit more towards maybe this blue. Because if I put that in there, it's very, very yellow. Whereas if we go with maybe a more muted blue-gray, because we have to think about what's influencing that transition in this area, and it's that shirt. It's not as obvious as that, because obviously it's going to be mixing with some of these more neutral skin tones, and especially up until it gets into the cheek area, then it starts to pick up some of that kind of more rosy color. But that's just going to add a little bit more dynamic range to the portrait. And then these warmer colors actually balance out a little bit more. So sometimes it's not that you don't have good colors everywhere, it's just that you need to push maybe the cool tones in a select area. So like carrying some of this down instead of having it so yellow green, maybe push it into more of a blue green. And as the skin tones start to move towards the backdrop, on this far side, they're going to take on more of a violet. It's a very subtle shift. You can see it's quite pale here, but if I select that color, it's kind of a neutral gray purple. And some of the pinks in her skin are maybe a little less. This color looks pretty good. It might be a little saturated. So if we desaturate that just a little bit. And make that just a little bit, maybe a little cooler. Let's try cooling that off just a little bit. That will help, again, moving between the warms and the cools. Same thing with the lips. You actually have a really nice color here. I think it'll suit well for that bottom lip. The upper lip is just a slightly darker version of that, but it's not quite that dark except for in the darkest shadow. But if you make that, take that color and just make a slightly darker version of that, you'll have a light color for that upper lip, because there is some light coming in on that upper lip. Not that you have to try and squeeze that in to this small of a color study, but it's just something you want to be aware of before you move into your larger painting. And same thing for this green shape. That was maybe a little strong. I would go in with maybe something more in these neutral ranges here. So maybe a couple of these mauve-y type of purple value colors will help to have as an accent range to work with. I would say your background color looks pretty good. It looks pretty close. If you wanted to, you could add a little more opacity and lightness to that side, and then push the hair value silhouette on that far side and a little bit more in a few areas here, again just to build some of that contrast that's going to help her stand out a little bit. And you might find as you do that, actually your shadow value seems good. I think this is just glare, so I think you're okay there. You'll want to make sure you have that darker little spot behind mixing right here. I'll just circle them. So try and mix up a couple of these, and maybe take this one and make it a little bit more, a little less yellow. Just let me know if you have any questions, Tammy. 30 minutes or so? Not right now? Okay. Give me just 1 second, guys. I have to run and do something really quick. I will be back in just 2 minutes, okay? Okay, I'm back. I apologize. Okay, so if you have any follow-up questions, Tammy, just let me know. Post it in the forum. Nice work. Okay, Penny, you are up. And I just wanted to ask really quick if this picture looks a little bit light to you. To me, it looks like it might have photographed on the lighter side. So I'm thinking I'm gonna bring the value, oops, down a little bit. It's just a little bit light. Okay, is that better? Okay, so I mean the background color looks like it's spot on, and yeah, I like your colors. I think they work really nicely. My main suggestion here is some of the colors look very, very pink, and she does have in this photo a little bit more of that rosiness to her skin. But my main suggestion would be here in this lower jaw is to take more of a neutral violet, almost similar to the background color, but just a little more light and opaque. I think if you have, because this plane is starting to turn down and face that, that backdrop, it does get a little more green as you show here, but it's maybe a little less yellow-green. Let me get a smaller brush here. But I would just introduce maybe a little bit of a cooler tone in this little side plane as it rounds down into the lower jaw. And then taking your darker green, maybe make it a little less yellow. I'm thinking maybe a little more of a, let's try something like that. Just bringing it more into like a gray. Only because it is picking up some of her shirt, but it's not as of a yellow green. And you'll notice down in her neck, it's the same kind of thing. It actually picks up more of the background violet rather than green. So just look at some of those shifts. You'll see here too, it's a similar effect. It has some of that more of a violet tendency. And this is something I talked about earlier. You'll notice on paler skin, it's going to go more of a bluish rather than a yellow. So if you just, it's okay to have some of those warmer halftones, but what I would do is just take maybe some of the color that you had placed there, so that you have like this color, and I would just push it maybe more towards blue. So maybe just pull it a little more neutral for those areas. Cool it off just a little bit. And it'll give you a nice dynamic range, because then you're going from this cool tone in here to like this nice warm tone in the upper half of the face. And that will kind of balance out that feeling of everything being too warm. It's okay to have some of those warm colors where you have them. You just want to introduce some of the cool colors. And you might consider some of that over here. Pushing your green. This looks like your green. I would just take away some of that yellow. Maybe throw in a little more blue. And you might have to adjust with some white to get it back to the right value. But try using something maybe a little more neutral like that. And that will help. Also, her shirt feels a little saturated. So I would take and maybe just add a little more ultramarine blue to that color and bring out a little bit less yellow. It gets quite dark down here too, so you know the general trend is something like that, and you can kind of fade off that arm as it kind of comes off the canvas in your bigger painting. And that's, you can see that already helped. It's a little more complementary to her skin tones. Well, part of the paleness too is the contrast, and I feel like you have the hair too yellow and too light. So work on pulling in some of those darker masses. And that's going to make her skin feel, by comparison, a little bit more pale because you're giving that contrast for some of that perspective. Does that make sense? So just to show you that difference, that makes her skin tones feel much brighter and more vibrant than having these competing values and colors. And you can use that trick I was talking about by combining the red, yellow, green highlights. When you get into the bigger painting, it's hard to do in a small color study at this scale, but when you get into the larger painting, you can start to utilize some of those, and it will get those these specular highlights like you see here in the cheekbone and on the brow ridge and the forehead. It'll give those that sparkle that you want. All right, do you have any questions? Oh, and her upper lip is a bit darker. Just, it's a little bit more of a berry color. That lower lip is a little more like that peachy tone, but the upper lip is a little cooler. So keep that in mind. But nice work. Yeah, good job. All right, Alexandra, are you in here? I think you said that you weren't able to attend live because of the time difference. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. But if you're here, say hello and let me know if you have any specific questions. So my feeling is that this picture could be a little warm, but I think with the background, what you're going to want to do is take it away a little bit from such a strong red violet and pull it more into a gray violet. So if you take the background color that you had and just introduce maybe some blue and a little more white, it should help neutralize that color a bit. And then take the dark brown and start to silhouette her hair because her hair got a little red. And she does have that red undertone to her hair, but this makes her look like she is more of a full redhead, and she has a little bit more of a deep brown to her hair. So build in some of that contrast. That's going to help her skin tones pop. And the next thing is the same thing for the shirt. I would just bring that value down a little bit and less chroma. It's a little bit more in the gray, green range, and that's going to help to complement her skin tones a little bit. So maybe less of the almost looks like a phthalo blue. It's a little chromatic for her skin tones, and it just pulls the eye away a little bit. With regards to the skin tone, so once you get these kind of other colors set up, we now know what the main influences are on the skin tones. I think your colors feel maybe just a tad yellow, and so I would look for where you can introduce a little bit more of a pink in this middle zone here, and a little bit more in the red zone across here. Down in the lower half, instead of going kind of yellow with that, try picking up a little bit of that background color in the lower jaw to help sculpt that form, because that plane is starting to face the background, so it's going to pick up some of that. And I feel like it got too pale maybe a little quick, so make sure you're looking for some of the values that work as these transition tones. And just have more steps moving towards that shadow, and it's going to round out that form, like in here, for example, looking at how that is another shape. And if you watch some of the videos from that I released today, I talk about using the planes as kind of your guide for where these colors are placed as well. And something you want to think about as you're working towards your larger painting. So adding a little bit of rosiness to that chin and more of a rosy color to the nose is going to start to bring out some of those colors. Her lips aren't nearly as red. They're more of a berry kind of pink. This upper lip is a deep kind of red mauve. So I would just neutralize that a little bit and then have your richest pink, kind of a cotton candy pink on that bottom lip there. So you can see some of that difference there. Just introducing a little bit more pink, and it pulls it right into the color zone that we have for that image. Okay, and also remember that controlling values is not just making someone's skin tone glow. It's not about how bright you bring this. I mean, while you need those light values, it's also about how much you control the values around the model. That includes the value of the shirt, the value of the hair, the value of your shadow mask. You know, if you bring everything a little bit darker, it really helps the skin tones feel like they're glowing. So it's about controlling the environment around your model and having value control across the form this direction. The more steps you kind of have going across this direction until you finally hit that beefy highlight on that forehead, you're going to have more, it's going to have more impact. Whereas if that light is spread out too wide, it's not going to feel like it glows nearly as much. Okay, nice work. I would just work on introducing a couple of those mauve tones into the palette. Like I said, there's this one here, and then it gets a little bit more neutral as it moves across the forehead. And then you want that kind of cooler gray in the lower jaw. And it doesn't quite look gray when we have it against the gray here, but it looks gray against the skin tones that we have in the painting. All right, nice work. If you have any follow-up questions, just post in the forum. And I look forward to seeing your painting. Everyone did really well. I know you guys said that the color studies were hard, and they are. They are definitely challenging. But you don't need to stress about this. That's why we do the first color study. It's so we can kind of take our first stab at mixing the right colors, and we can go through the process of analyzing them before we attempt it on our nice underpaintings that we've been developing this whole time. Okay, so Marianne, I know you said that you didn't have time to do your color study, but you did send me, did you send me your underpainting? Is this the updated one? I actually don't think did you send one to me? I'm not sure. I can't tell if this is the one I had edited or if you had sent something. But I don't think I got anything from you. So if you have any questions, there were a couple of people who couldn't get the color studies to me. If you guys missed this week's critique because you couldn't finish the color study in time, just post it in the forum. And those of you who work on these, you edit your color study or you do a new one after watching the tiling video, then submit them on the forum and I'll give you feedback. Okay? Does anyone have any last minute questions? Our critique went a little bit faster today, just a little bit. But we didn't have nearly as many people to get through. And I will, this afternoon, I will post in the forum a couple of links about the lighting, a couple more tips on photographing your paintings. And this morning, I posted a little bit about what to expect over the next week. So if we are going to meet next weekend, I'm only going to do that if there are some major questions that people have. Then we'll maybe do one session where everybody meets in one group, but there won't be critiques next weekend. because you guys are going to still be working on your painting. If you need feedback on your color study before then, just post it in the forum and I'll get back to you. So Brenda, you asked, you sent me your corrections and your underpainting. I think I did. Did I not respond to you? Brenda, let me make a note of that and I will email you when I send you the your color study. But I think it looked okay. It looked just fine. That's why I didn't bring it in for corrections. But let me actually, let me go back to yours. Did I have it in a hidden layer? I might have. Oh, I think I did. I just forgot about that. Sorry. Yeah, you know what? Let me, I'll email you specifics on that, but I think it looks pretty good as far as your line along this edge here, though. Make sure you just have a softer edge. Sorry, got to get the right layer to show up. Just make sure you have a little bit of a softer edge on this transition. I would just, you know, maybe scumble a little bit of a middle value right there. And then add a little bit more light on this bottom lip just to bring it out a little bit more. But I can do a little bit more of a detailed paint over and send that to you if you'd like. Oh, and another thing is you might consider toning down the background because that's going to make a big difference in the overall feel. You might just glaze, you know, the background with umber one more time before we go into color, and that will help her feel a little bit brighter. Oh, you're very, very welcome. Okay, guys, thank you for joining me. I'm really glad you guys could pop in today. I'll see you in the forum, of course, and I'll keep everyone updated as to whether or not we're going to meet next weekend. Like I said, it'll only be if there's a lot of people with a lot of questions. If not, we'll be just interacting through the forum and we'll plan on having our critique the weekend following. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Have a really lovely weekend and good luck on your paintings, and I hope you guys enjoy this week's lessons. All right, have a good one, guys.